Satan is a relative latecomer to the Judaeo-Christian tradition. Sometime early in the 6th century BCE, the Jewish people were taken into captivity in Babylon and held there for about 50 or 60 years. At that time, it was quite common for a conquering power to take captive large sectors of the conquered populace, removing influential people, disrupting social structures, holding people essentially as hostages in order to control the population that's left behind, exploiting these captives as a workforce. All of these were good reasons for this practice. And at this time, the people of Israel were subjected to this by the rulers of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar and that mob. Later, Cyrus, who conquered the Babylonians and established the first Persian Empire, allowed these captive peoples to return to their homeland, or I guess in some cases it was their descendants who returned. This is all kind of a big deal in the Old Testament. It's a watershed moment in the history of Israel. Okay, so that's some background for what I'm about to discuss. Now, let's talk about Satan. Despite the fact that many modern Christians make a very big deal of Satan, there are surprisingly few references to Satan in the Old Testament. Let's clear one thing up immediately. The Old Testament does not identify the serpent in the Garden of Eden with Satan. Mostly that idea comes from the book of Revelation. There are a few other references in the New Testament that point in this direction, and there are some later Jewish traditions which make this connection, but the Old Testament itself doesn't make that identification. But let's take a look at the places in the Old Testament where the word Satan seems to be used to refer to a particular being. I say this because it does actually have a simple secular meaning too, without being a proper name. Basically, it means adversary or enemy in a purely worldly sense, and it's used this way several times in the Old Testament. But there are places where it seems to refer to a specific individual, or perhaps to an office of some kind. In the book of the prophet Zechariah, Satan appears as an accuser standing before the angel of the Lord, accusing Joshua the high priest, and the Lord rebukes Satan in this vision. So from Zechariah chapter 3 verses 1 to 2. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" It's generally agreed that the book of Zechariah, the first 8 chapters at least, were written shortly after the return from captivity, perhaps around 520 BCE. Here, Satan seems to be playing the role of, well, devil's advocate, a kind of prosecuting attorney, perhaps, in the court of God. Satan certainly isn't fallen here. There's no suggestion that he's the Lord of hell or any such thing. He seems to be playing an essential role within God's court. And the same seems to be true in the book of Job. In Job chapters 1 and 2, Satan appears in the heavenly court as an adversary or as an accuser. He challenges the integrity of Job, suggesting that Job is faithful to God only because of his prosperity. And with God's permission, Satan inflicts suffering on Job to test Job's righteousness. The role Satan plays here is very similar to the role he plays vis-a-vis Joshua in the Zechariah passage. Again, he's not described here as fallen. He is part of God's court and seems to be playing some kind of official role. The date of the book of Job is somewhat problematic. It's very unclear, and opinions range from sometime during the patriarchal period in the 2nd millennium BCE, which is very early, to the Hellenistic period in the 3rd and 2nd century BC, so really late. So this is not particularly helpful. Satan also gets a mention in the first book of Chronicles. In 1 Chronicles 21:1, we read, "Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel." In the earlier version of this story, found in 2 Samuel 24, it's God, in his anger against Israel, who orders David to undertake this census. Again, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go and take a census of Israel and Judah." Now, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are a retelling of Israel's earlier history after the return from captivity in the later part of the 5th or the early part of the 4th century BCE. After those catastrophic events, it was probably felt that the earlier history needed to be reviewed and revised. The authors of Chronicles certainly had the earlier historical books as sources. It's interesting that Satan takes the place of God in this later account. Is he perhaps beginning to be viewed as an adversary of God, in some way responsible for the disobedience of Israel? Possibly, but he still isn't depicted as a fallen angel or as the Lord of hell. Because of the way Zechariah and Chronicles depict Satan, I'm inclined to think that Job falls into this same period because of the very similar role that he plays. Of course, I can't be sure of that. Certainly, though, there's no indication in the Old Testament that Satan is any kind of fallen, rebellious angel in charge of the dominion of hell, or some kind of powerful being working in opposition to God. He seems to have a role in God's counsel as some kind of accuser or prosecuting attorney, if you like, a role sanctioned by God. At some time between the return from captivity in around 520 BCE and the writing of the New Testament, the concept of Satan underwent a dramatic shift. Now, during the later years of the captivity, and presumably in the years following the return to Israel, the Jewish people came into contact with a Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. This was a strongly dualistic religion, with the world seen as a battleground between the forces of good, led by Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, and the forces of evil, led by Angra Mainyu, or sometimes known as Ahriman. These are not equal in power. Ahura Mazda is supreme, but Angra Mainyu represents the destructive spirit, the evil principle in creation. This certainly influenced Jewish thinking, and during the post-exilic period, the period between the two testaments, there's an increasing dualism in Judaism as well. The somewhat vaguely defined figure of Satan is increasingly seen as a force for evil in the world. In Zoroastrianism, Ahura Mazda is ultimately victorious, and the world will undergo a final renovation. Evil will be destroyed, and all of creation will be purified and brought into a state of perfection. Sound familiar? We see Judaism developing these ideas during this intertestamental period, for instance in the Book of Enoch and in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Up until this point, and throughout most of the Old Testament, the story is not about some kind of cosmic struggle between good and evil. It's about Israel's status as the chosen people, their constant straying and disobedience, and God's corrective punishments. If Satan has a role in this, and it's not much of a role, it's as some kind of devil's advocate, a kind of prosecuting attorney. This is a role in God's counsel. The idea of some kind of cosmic struggle between good and evil only enters Jewish thought after they encountered Zoroastrianism, during and after the captivity. And I imagine this event itself, the captivity, had a profound impact on the way the people of Israel viewed themselves and their place in the world. I guess worldly domination seemed less and less likely, hence an appeal to some kind of apocalyptic event. Obviously, this then went on to influence the early Christians and the New Testament. I think it's fascinating to look at how beliefs evolve and change over time, how cultures interact and influence each other, how sometimes, perhaps all the time, a society will go back and reconsider its history in the light of later events, as the chronicler did, for instance, in the Old Testament. I suggest that's why history is never a finished product. We will go on, for instance, writing new histories of the French Revolution, just as we continue to write histories of the Roman Empire still today. We often think of Christianity as the heir of Judaism, and certainly Christianity has its roots in that culture and that tradition. But later Judaism itself owes a debt to Zoroastrianism, and so does Christianity. There are other influences too, of course, Greek and Roman, for example. But the impact of Zoroastrianism on the development of later Judaism and Christianity is enormous, particularly in this increasingly dualistic view of the world, and very clearly in the development of the idea that many branches of Christianity have of Satan today.